Hello everyone, Pastor Jeff here with some thoughts of grace. Who is your hero? Maybe it's your mom or dad. Maybe it's an athlete or a writer, a political figure, a cultural icon. Usually all of us have at least one person who we look up to, who we respect, whose accomplishments have impacted us in a positive way. We're going to take a look at Luke chapter 9, and it's the transfiguration of Jesus. And his disciples are seeing this, and while they're seeing Jesus being transfigured, they also see two of their country's biggest heroes. So let's take a look at it. Luke chapter 9, verses 28. About 8 days after this conversation, he took along Peter, John, and James and went up onto the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Peter and those with him were in a deep sleep, and when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who were standing with him. As the two men were departing from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let's set up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not really knowing what he was saying. While he was saying this, a cloud appeared and overshadowed them. They became afraid as they entered the cloud. Then a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him." Let's appreciate for a moment what this must have been like, what this must have meant for 3 Jewish men. In our textbooks in America, there are certain men and women who are paid respect for contributing in a significant way to the country. Men and women like Benjamin Franklin, Susan B. Anthony, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King. If you are a follower of Jesus, there's probably some heroes that you look up to in history as well. Heroes such as Martin Luther, William Seymour, Corrie ten Boom, Billy Graham, or David Wilkerson. Maybe one of your heroes is somebody who led you to Christ. But for Peter, James, and John, it's different. You see, for them to see Moses and Elijah, this was equivalent of them meeting their national political hero like Abraham Lincoln, a cultural hero like Martin Luther King, and a spiritual hero like Billy Graham, and you smash all those people together into one person. In the nation of Israel, there was political, there was spiritual significance, and there was cultural significance. And so Peter and Elijah fit all of those categories, and they got to see them both. For some reason, we see Peter and James and John, they were selected to witness this event, and how special that was for them to be chosen out of the 12. In verse 29, it says, "As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white." Matthew and Mark use the term transfigured or transformed. For a moment, Jesus was shedding all of his earthly limitations, and he was allowing his deity to shine through in such a way that his form was literally transforming. It was changing before their very eyes. And light was beginning to emanate from his being, and it was beginning to give him this sparkling, dazzling effect. Imagine being in a deep sleep and then waking up to that. I wonder if Peter felt like he missed out on something. He was asleep during a lot of this, and he slept through this transition where Jesus was starting to sparkle and glow, and oh, by the way, Moses and Elijah is showing up. I wonder if that's the reason why he wanted to build those shelters. He didn't want them to leave just yet. Of course, it is silly to think about us building a shelter for people who have already passed on, much less building a shelter for the Son of God who happened to be glowing at the moment. But there's a little more context for us to look at. You see, in all of this, he was honoring the past works of God. These were two huge figures that were being represented here. Moses represented the law and the establishment of the nation of Israel. And Elijah represented the prophets and the saving of Israel. And what an honor to witness this moment. There was a way that the Israelites would remember significant moments like this in the Old Testament. One of those ways was through feasts and through ceremonies. And one of the feasts that we see in the Old Testament is the Feast of Tabernacles. This feast was a way for the nation of Israel to remember when the Israelites would build booths in the desert as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. It is symbolic of God choosing to dwell amongst his people by dwelling in the tabernacle, and where he protected and provided for them wherever they went. So when Peter saw that Moses and Elijah were leaving, he made this suggestion to Jesus as a kind of throwback to how they worshiped before. There was some legitimacy to his suggestion. Today we have the luxury of looking back on what God has done. This virus and the response to the pandemic has taken some things from us. But what it cannot take away from us is what God has done. God is still on the throne. He has still worked and is involved in our lives. He has still done great things. We still have our testimony. We still have our story of how God came to redeem us and to save us. And like the feast of the Old Testament, our story of what God has done serves as a reminder that should inform our continuous worship. What has God done in the past that you can thank him for today? What has he done that causes you to worship him today? But in all of this, there's more context to this story. You see, Peter's heart was not completely pure and innocent. He brought up this suggestion to build booths for Jesus and these Old Testament figures while they were leaving. And this feast would take several days. They were done. There was no reason for this meeting to continue between Jesus, Moses, and Elijah except for Peter's own selfish interests. He didn't want it to end. This was such a cool experience. He wanted it to continue. And in his request to build these booths and to have this festival, he was associating Jesus as if he was on the same level as Moses and Elijah. You see, to Peter, this was just another cool experience. This was another cool story. He was missing out on what was really taking place here. You see, our reverence for the past should never outweigh our present worship. Peter had a churchy way of doing this, didn't he? He tried to make the best of this request to be about worship, but instead he was trying to make God fit into a molding he saw fit. In essence, he was making an idol where he fashioned an idol in his mind that had the appearance of Jesus, but didn't have the essence of Jesus. Think about it. He could worship Jesus anywhere, and he was. He didn't have to dust off this Feast of Tabernacle stuff. He didn't have to suggest this building of the booths. But why did he do that? Why did he suggest it? I remember a time in Bible college where it was the end of our first year, and we were tired and we were ready for school to be over, but we recognized we were going to miss each other, so we kind of threw ourselves a bash. We were outside near the woods. We hung up some tree lights and some of those white Christmas tree lights, hanging them throughout the trees to kind of give this nice atmosphere. We started a bonfire, and we started to sing some worship songs. And that ended up being a powerful moment for many of us because God was speaking to our hearts and he was moving. And it became such a great time that Next year, we wanted to do the same thing. And it was the end of the year again, and we decided, let's do what we did last year. And so it had the same trimmings as before. We had the bonfire, we had the lights, we had the guy with the guitar playing worship music. But it didn't have that same feel to it, that same life-giving feel to it. Instead, it felt empty, it felt awkward, it felt weird. And we recognized that instead of worshiping God and seeking Him for what He wanted to do in our lives, we were clinging to a moment in the past, trying to recreate it for our own selfish pleasure. We wanted the feeling, but not God. We wanted the experience, but we didn't want the Creator. We wanted something powerful, but not the Almighty. It wasn't until we let go of this idea of recreating what had already happened that God started to move. We prayed over each other and we began to prophesy. In some ways, it was even more powerful than the first year, but we just had to let go so that God could do what only He could do. What ways are you clinging to the past that prevents you from being involved with what God is doing today? I catch myself all the time. I want to be in church again. I want to have church like we used to, where we're in the sanctuary and we actually get to see people face to face. You know, and that's a reality, I think, for a lot of us. And it's great to acknowledge all the things that God has done in the building at 4220 Fate Road. It's good to want to be with each other and be in each other's company. And I hope that we once again will be able to do that. But today, God is still moving. Today, God is still speaking. And I don't want to miss it. I don't want my fondness for our building and the memories of the past to outweigh my present worship. And finally, in all of this, when in doubt, just worship Jesus. We see God speaking as Peter is giving his foolish suggestion to build the booths and the shelters for Jesus and those Old Testament figures. He said, "This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him." It was like God made them privy to the fact that there is a connection between Jesus and the Old Testament figures, but He wanted to make sure that there was no doubt that Jesus was the fulfillment of the law of Moses and the fulfillment of the prophets of Elijah. Jesus was what the Old Testament was all about. And now He is there in their midst. Peter didn't have to celebrate a festival that honored God and how He at one time used to dwell in the tabernacle. Instead, he can rejoice in the fact that God's presence was right there with him. The very same presence that you and I experience today. The same presence that we experience because the Holy Spirit dwells in our hearts and in our minds, and that we can worship Him in spirit and truth today. We've experienced some changes in how we interact with one another and how we worship. And in spite of all this change, it comes down to worshiping Jesus. When the coronavirus restrictions are lifted, guess what? It's still going to be worshiping Jesus. When this ban is lifted, I don't want to go back to the same old things just because that's the way we've always done them. I want to learn from God and what He is teaching me today so that I can worship Him when He leads me to something different. I want to learn from Him today so that even if something ends up being the same, I can still worship Him in spirit and in truth. Today, are you worshiping Jesus, or are you simply trying to fit Jesus into your agenda and try to fit Jesus into a religious experience that you think makes sense because you have experienced it before? Do you spend more time thinking of the past instead of seeking Jesus and what He wants to do in your heart right now? Today is the day for you to refocus your heart and mind on Jesus Christ. He is speaking. All you have to do is listen to Him. Thank you for joining me today as we looked at these thoughts of grace. I hope that they were encouraging for you. Hope to see you this Sunday as Pastor Doug is going to be on our webpage and on our website as he gives this message on keeping it together. Hope to see you then. God bless.